Okay, so a bit of context first. My cat likes to go outside every day. In the morning, he follows us to the door, takes the elevator down with us, and then goes about his day outside until we bring him back home again in the evening. My cat is not the most punctual of guys, so it's pretty common for him to stay much later in the neighborhood, sometimes well into the night or for several days even. Or he gets bored and doesn't play for more than 2 hours and wants to go back inside immediately. The problem is that we're not home, so he just has to wait there. My family and I live in an apartment on the first floor, so my cat's solution is to sit under one of our balconies and meow at the top of his lungs to get our attention. When we're home, it works perfectly fine, but obviously when we're not, it's a lot less effective. Our solution was to gently ask our neighbors that have the key to our apartment to bring him up, so we didn't have to wait outside all day. Those that don't have the key sometimes let him inside the building, so he's not just literally outside though. For example, when it's raining. Our apartment is a bit special because it's bigger than the others, so to get inside there are 2 ways you can get in. One is to take the stairs to the left in the main hall and open the door that has 2 locks. 2 is to use the elevator with the special key that goes directly to our apartment. The door on that only has 1 lock. The cat was used to the second option, and me too honestly because we're both very lazy. But when the neighbors that don't have the key let him inside the building, he goes up the stairs and waits. Since I usually use the elevator from parking 2 floors below, that means I don't see him waiting in the hall and he meows outside the door to get me to open up for him, or my dad or mom. All around we have our habits with my parents and neighbors, and it works fairly well. Now that you know how everything goes with my little guy, here's what happened just a little while ago. My parents like the outdoors very much, so I'm usually left alone on the weekends. Generally, this means taking care of the chores and inviting my friends over so we can have the apartment to ourselves, which is a pretty nice experience. This time, I was alone. It was late, 11 p.m.-ish, and I was just chilling in the living room before hearing some meowing over the sound of the TV. Someone had let my cat into the building apparently, and he was waiting outside the door. I took my keys and began to open the first lock. Now, I don't know about other pet owners, but I know my cat's meows by heart. It's a rising kind of meow that's very high-pitched and very cute, and also has a specific rhythm. I've been hearing it nearly every day for 5 years, so I have to know it well. I stopped. The noise wasn't what it usually was. It was too deep and seemed off. This isn't my cat outside my door. He's the only cat around that knows he has to wait by the door and scream to be let inside. By that point, I stopped halfway through opening the door and waited to hear him again. I began to notice scratching. My cat never scratched that door. At this point, I was super weirded out by the situation, but the meowing was getting super loud and I didn't want the neighbors to be woken up. I started to continue with my key, but suddenly I heard another noise that freaked me the fuck out. A cough. For the record, I'm not a very cautious person, and in my whole 21 years of living in this apartment, I must have looked into that peephole a total of maybe 5 times altogether. A small part of my brain, though, told me to do it that night, and thank God it did. I let go of my keys and put my eye up against the door when I saw it. A man I'd never seen before standing right there, meowing in front of my door. To say I was terrified is really an understatement, but my heart nearly stopped. I just stood there petrified for what felt like an hour. I don't really know how long it took for me to move again, but eventually my body just took over, I guess. I did what you'd expect. I ran for my phone, stood in the corner of the living room cowering, and called the police. By the time they arrived, the man in front of the door was long gone. I can't even remember when he'd stopped meowing. They took my testimony before telling me to be cautious, and then they just left. To this day, I still don't know what that meowing guy wanted, and I'm not sure I want to anyway. I also have no idea how he even got inside the building in the first place, since you need a key to access it, and how he knew I would open the door if he imitated my cat right in front of it. Needless to say, I'll be careful from now on. And my cat did eventually come back since then. He's sleeping in my bed as I'm writing this. This happened about 4 years ago, back when I was a lot younger and more desperate for money. It was a Friday. My girlfriend and I wanted to go to the local casino with one of our friends, just to have some drinks and lose a bit of cash on the slots. It was a much cheaper alternative to going out and drinking all night, since you could just spend $10 and drink for free at the casino the entire night, as long as you kept on playing the slots. We got there at around 6 p.m. My girlfriend and her friend dressed in their best, and me just kinda slapped together into something a bit better than just woke up. I was the only male in the group, and while I was quite slender at the time, I also had a full beard and a shaven head, so it would have been very difficult to mistake me as a female. We played the slots until about midnight, taking full advantage of those free drinks. I was the designated driver, however, so I just drank Coke the entire night while my girlfriend and her friend got absolutely blasted. Once the last of the money we brought with us ran out, we decided to call it quits and head home. The parking lot is on the furthest side of the casino, and we were parked on the 3rd floor. The casino's parking lot was 4 stories high, and you could either take the stairs on the left or up an elevator on the right. On each floor, there was a massive sliding door that led to the parking lot once you got up there. As we made our way towards the stairwell, though, some chubby guy in a trench coat stumbled up to me, clearly very drunk, and wrapped his arm around my shoulder. I'm quite a friendly person, so I just kind of stood there and waited to see what this man wanted before shrugging him off. He had greasy, curly black hair, and I remember his breath smelled deeply of cigarettes. My girlfriend and her friend just hung back, silently laughing at me since this kind of thing happened very often to me. For some reason, it seemed drunk people just really like me. He leaned in closer and told me he'd just won real big and couldn't remember where he parked his car. He pulled out a big wad of cash from his pocket and told me that if I could help him find his car, he'd give me $1K. I was absolutely floored, since that was the most cash I had ever seen in my life. Of course, I agreed to it immediately. We walked towards the parking lot together, his arms still around my shoulder and his weight leaned into me. My plan was to search the 1st floor with his car keys and go up to the next level if we didn't find it. He had his arm around me the whole time as we made our way to the entrance of the lot. My girlfriend and her friend going towards the stairs as the guy and I walked towards the entrance to level 1. The whole time he was just talking really loud to me, his words slurring as he stumbled all around the place. The moment my girlfriend and her friend ducked out of sight though, he immediately tightened his grip around my neck and looked me dead in the eyes. $1K for finding my car, and anal. He tightened his grip even further and tried to twist my arm. I was stunned for a moment as he started dragging me toward the elevator, his hands still trying to grasp for my arm. Luckily, I used to do a bit of MMA for a few years when I was younger, so I knew at least how to get out of a grapple. Those long hours of training kicked right in. I slipped my head out from his arm and pulled myself free before he could tighten his grip further. He frantically tried to grab me again, his fingernails raking across the skin of my arm. As I pulled back from him and took a few steps away, immediately he stood straight upright and hurriedly walked through the door to level 1, his drunken stumble completely gone as he ducked out of sight. I ran back to my friends in the stairwell. They saw the entire thing and were laughing their heads off, thinking about how funny the whole situation was. When they saw how deep the scratches he left on my arm were when I broke free though, they realized just how serious the situation had been. It's scary to think they would have just stood there and watched me get taken away, thinking it was just some drunk guy messing with me. But the guy had only pretended to be drunk. So, to the guy who pretended to be drunk and tried to drag me into an elevator, let's not meet again. This incident occurred over the past year, and I was so rattled by it that I hadn't gotten a chance to process it until very recently. I decided to write the entirety of what happened down. I don't even use Reddit really, but I knew of this subreddit and am hoping that in the rare chance that somebody out there knows the man in this story, maybe they can get him some help. I also want to share it though so that if he has any more victims, maybe they'll consider sharing their experience as well. It's a bizarre but admittedly entertaining story. So for all those reasons, I share it with you now. As an 18-year-old male, I never in my life thought I'd ever have any association with a stalker. I mean, in the media, stalker stories are always portrayed as some creepy bottom feeder becoming obsessed with a sweet but clueless girl and slowly invading every aspect of her privacy. My encounter with a stalker was far different, however, and occurred during the first time I was ever on my own. The incident was pretty lengthy, and as a result, this recounting will be as well. I'm originally from the East Coast, but I'm currently a freshman attending college in Los Angeles. Due to COVID, the dorms were closed and classes virtual, but I ended up coming to LA anyway, getting an apartment close by the campus. I was really excited to move across the country and live on my own in a new city, get a taste of adulthood for a full year. I wasn't completely alone though. I had friends from the past who also ended up in LA as well. My friend Tommy particularly was a very close friend that I had made at camp a few years ago, who attended another college in LA. My other friend Felix was incidentally also from the same camp. Back in the day, the three of us had been very close. Felix had decided to take the year off and make music with his friends in LA. My apartment building was only about 8 buildings down from his. However, with my packed weeks and free weekends, our schedules were nearly the opposite. His weekends were busy with work, and he had relative freedom during the week. As a result, I ended up growing particularly close to Tommy. We would alternate who went where due to the 20-mile Uber ride between us. Keep this in mind. Oftentimes, Tommy and I would hang out with Felix and his other friends whenever Tommy came to my area of the city. With all of that background, you should have a good idea of the context of the story. My apartment was about a 5-minute walk from a downtown area with all the highlights: restaurants, groceries, coffee shops, boutiques. When I first moved in the fall, I took full advantage of the pleasant nights in contrast to my home's often harsh climate by taking long walks at night through the well-lit and populated streets. I wanted to explore and get familiar with my neighborhood. LA is a beautiful city with a very dynamic culture and unbeatable weather, but it does have the constant and often harsh reminder of homelessness, many of whom have mental illnesses and have otherwise been discarded by society. I had grown to despise the indifference shown toward them by people on the street, who avoided their eyes at all costs as if their life depended on it. In particular, during my first week, I was crossing a major boulevard when I noticed a man who appeared to be homeless in a wheelchair, with one of his wheels caught deep in a pothole. He wasn't making any noise, but he was flailing around very frantically. I was far behind him and could not believe that people were just walking right past him, looking down at their phones even as they passed by. I wasn't even going to make it to the other side in accordance with crossing time myself, but I expected surely someone around me would help him. Still, people passed by without ever acknowledging him. I was so frustrated, I ended up yelling at the people ahead of me in the crosswalk and got a middle finger back for my troubles. I asked the man if he needed some help. He didn't talk, but he nodded very enthusiastically. He was crumpled into what seemed like a wrinkled but finely made tuxedo jacket. I could only see his frizzy, blackish gray hair thrashing in the clothes. I got his wheel out of the pothole and quickly wheeled him across the street. As I got him onto the sidewalk, he abruptly turned to me, exposing his face to me only inches away. I pulled away, both because he was too close to me in the middle of a pandemic, and because of his startling face as well. He was tan, a deep, worn tan with deep sun wrinkles, like you'd imagine on old people at a Florida beach. forming what almost looked like a mask. His eyes were sunken deeply into his head, completely dead. I mean, completely vacant. It didn't even look like he was looking at me, but through me to somewhere else far away. "Get the fuck away!" He growled in a voice that was so raspy it didn't even sound human. I scoffed at the man and continued walking, assuming that would be the last I would ever see of him, especially in a city of 4 million people. This considering I passed hundreds of strangers a day that I would never ever see again. I continued on with my life for some time, nearly forgetting about him entirely, but unfortunately, that did not last long. To walk to the grocery store, I have to pass through an area with a great amount of foot traffic. In this area one afternoon, I spotted a man far in front of me that was soon to pass me by walking oddly. It wasn't exactly a limp, it was almost like he was drunk. It wasn't until I got closer that I recognized his blank eyes and frizzy hair. This time though, there was no wheelchair in sight. There was something about the man that raised major red flags with me. Maybe it was the vacancy of his eyes, or some judgmental gut instinct that told me to get far away. I tried to reserve as much judgment as I could, because I figured he likely had some sort of mental illness. I was hoping to pass him quickly without acknowledgement, but when I got up beside him, he stopped walking, causing me to momentarily pause in surprise. It sent a shiver down my spine, but I smiled politely at him and quickly kept walking. After that incident, I began to see him many more times, and every time he'd turn in my direction. I learned to ignore it though and barely register it. He went away for a while, and I foolishly thought that would be the end of our encounters. Months after I'd stopped seeing him around, Tommy was supposed to come over to my apartment. We were supposed to pick up alcohol for all of us before going over to Felix and his friend's apartment to hang out. As we were about to enter the liquor store, I could see the tall man with the tuxedo jacket standing at the intersection several feet past the store. I was somewhat disappointed he had come back, but it wasn't like it was the end of the world, especially because Tommy and I had long since learned to ignore him. I didn't even bother to explain the situation to Tommy though. Anyway, we just checked out and left the store, taking a left to a nearby intersection away from the one I had originally spotted him at. And guess who was standing right there at the crosswalk? My heart sunk, knowing it would be only the three of us waiting for the crossing sign to change. Tommy was talking to me, completely oblivious to the situation, but I could see the man beside him slowly turn towards us. Tommy saw my face change immediately and turned toward the man. Tommy quickly turned back toward me, giving me a look upon seeing the man's face. The sign finally changed and we walked quickly across the street. Tommy continued talking to me, but at this point I was very rattled. Up until that point, I had never had such prolonged direct contact with the man. "Hey man, are you good?" Tommy asked. I explained to him that I had been seeing this man everywhere all across my area of the city, and every time I'd see him he'd give me that death glare. Tommy didn't really take me seriously though, and clowned on me for being so worried. We got to Felix's house, and Tommy soon forgot about the incident while we were hanging out. But I did not. We all got fairly drunk, but I just couldn't shake this nagging sense of dread. Eventually, around 2 a.m., Tommy had taken an Uber back to his apartment, and many of the guys were now going to bed. Honestly, I was still quite buzzed and irrationally afraid to walk that late at night, unlike the dozens of other nights I'd done exactly the same thing. I was comforted by reminding myself I had only seen him in the commercial area, not the residential blocks around where we were. There were 2 cross streets between our buildings, and the walk usually took about 2 minutes. That night, I was particularly paranoid and hurried. The streets were nearly empty, being that deep into the night and all. I passed one of the crossroads, but as I got closer to the next one, I saw a figure sitting on the curb of the intersection, diagonal from the one I was about to reach. My heart started pounding immediately, but I reassured myself it could just be a drunk college student. As I got closer though, I could see the white streaks in the man's hair. You know those moments when you see something so shocking, You momentarily tunnel vision? It was exactly that. Combined with my drunkenness, I almost fell over once I realized who it was. I turned around and wondered if I should just run back to Felix's apartment. In that moment, the man rose his head from his lap, glaring at me with his empty eyes. That moment is one of the only moments in my life that I've genuinely felt in danger. I got to the intersection hesitantly, pausing at the sidewalk opening to the intersection. I expected him to stand up, but he did not. He stayed sitting on the curb, waiting for my decision. I looked down the cross street and wondered if I should walk around the block so he wouldn't know where I lived, but part of me wanted to sprint to my building just 200 feet ahead of me. My apartment building was large enough that he would never know my apartment, but still, the thought of him even knowing my address was unsettling. I was running through the choices in my head when I thankfully heard two guys approach the intersection from the opposite side of the crossroads, right in the path of the man on the curb. They were both deeply drunk, but right once they saw him, they looked at him, both looked at each other, and then looked at me and froze. "Hey, there you guys are!" I yelled at them, beckoning them down the crossroad. They picked it up almost immediately, and then yelled hey back, passing him by. As we walked down from the intersection, one of them asked if I was okay. I explained to them what was going on, knowing they probably wouldn't even remember in the morning. We reached the street parallel to mine. They reached their building and said goodbye to me, and I was alone again. It had to have been 3 a.m. by that point. I was exhausted. I decided to sprint home to my building from the other direction than where he was, so I could quickly slip into the building without seeing whether he was still there. When I got to the door, I couldn't help myself and looked at the intersection as I unlocked the door. He was gone. I quickly opened the door and closed it behind me. I pressed the elevator call button, anxiously watching outside the door through the glass wall. I still didn't feel safe until I got back into the elevator, after which I let out the biggest sigh of relief. I never told my parents this story. They were already so nervous about me living on my own so far away that they would lose their minds and likely would have made me come home if I had told them. After that fiasco, I stayed in my apartment for a few days, working from there instead of going out into public. A few days in, I realized I was being ridiculous though, and left to get a coffee in town. Luckily, he wasn't there this time. For weeks, I continued to walk through the commercial area without any sight of the man. Weeks turned into months, which turned to academic terms. I had gone home during the winter for winter break, and when I came back, I still had yet to see him again. After enough time had passed, I assumed he was just gone. Maybe he was just trying to scare me, and he was satisfied after doing so that night, so he'd moved on to another victim. Once again, I made the stupid, naive assumption I would never see him again. By that time, it was late into the spring term, and people had started to go back to their homes all over the country. A couple of weeks before I left LA, Tommy and I were hanging out one last time the night before he was flying home. I had grown to appreciate Tommy's apartment. It was one of the only places I felt entirely safe due to being so far from my neighborhood of the city. I had previously told Tommy about the events that occurred that particular night. He finally believed me after that. The night of the final incident, I was over at his apartment, and the night was as normal as could be. Late into the night, Tommy and I decided to take a walk to a 24-hour donut shop just a couple blocks north of his building. We got to the shop pretty quickly and ordered our donuts. We were the only ones in that shop, except for the two other employees, so we were served almost immediately. As we left the shop, Tommy turned around, only now it was his face who dropped. Tommy was the kind of person that when he has a look of dread, you are far up Schitt's Creek without a paddle. I turned around slowly in response and felt like I was going to faint. Standing under the dim light of the donut shop was that man, in the same dirty flip-flops, wife-beater, torn pants pulled up to his chest, and tuxedo jacket I had come to associate with him. He stood there, staring at us. No, not us. Me, specifically. This time, though, his eyes weren't empty. They were focused on mine like a laser, and I could see fury behind them. Tommy and I were silent for a second. both of us frozen. I looked over at Tommy and mouthed to run. In that second, the two of us sprinted back to his apartment at our fastest possible speed. Tommy never looked back, but when he was flashing his card to get past the locked door, I could see the man's uneven gait trundling down the sidewalk towards us. The door unlocked and we ran into the lobby, slamming the automatically locking door behind us. We sprinted up the stairs to his floor, where we caught our breath in the hallway. Tommy had a look of disbelief in his eyes, and I was shaking with adrenaline. To this day, I have no clue how the man could have gotten 20 miles and knew exactly where we were. It must have required such deep surveillance. I felt like I was going to puke just thinking about it. Tommy was completely rattled and gladly left Los Angeles behind the following day. I was there for another week or so, but I was so busy with finals and packing that I didn't leave my apartment. I don't think I'll ever know what that man wanted from me, or why he harassed me for months. By no means is this supposed to deter people from helping the less fortunate, but in rare instances, good deeds can unknowingly come at dark costs. I'd like to be noble and say I don't regret helping him, but unfortunately I do. When I come back to Los Angeles in the fall, I'll be in the dorms, as will Tommy. Somehow, that man was able to follow me 20 miles, so what's to say he won't also find me in the dorms, only a few hundred feet away from my old apartment? I can't call the police. What would I say? The man hadn't technically done anything wrong, and furthermore, LA was filled with vagrants, far out of the light of the police. I won't tell my parents either, because they'll kill me knowing I kept it from them the whole year. I can only wonder what will happen this fall, and I guess only time will tell. This encounter happened 13 years ago. At the time, I was 14 years old. My then best friend lived just down the street from me. My cousin was dating her older brother, so I basically spent every day at her place. She lived on the 5th floor of a block of flats. It had 18 floors, so more often than not, I'd just get the elevator. On this particular day, I was waiting on the elevator and it was taking a long while. Not unusual, I guess. As I said, this building had 18 floors, so sometimes you had to wait for a bit if other people were using it. While I was waiting, though, a man entered the building and stood beside me waiting on the elevator also. Not so odd, but something about this guy had me very unnerved. The strangest part is, I can't even say what about him made me uneasy. Looking back, he just seemed like a completely normal guy. He looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s, with short dark hair, a medium height and build, a short beard, and dressed well enough. Something about him, though, was just off. I could feel his eyes on me as I continued to wait for the elevator. I'm a girl, and I've always been very small and looked younger than I was. Back then, I was lucky if I could barely make it to 5 feet, and I looked about 11 or 12. I've had stranger danger and how dangerous people can be drilled into my head since I was little, and while it seems silly to be this terrified of a random man just waiting on an elevator same as me, I decided it best to listen to my instincts. Turned out that was the best decision I've ever made. I casually walked to the stairwell, which is around the corner from the elevator. I walk in, and the second I'm out of sight and the door closed, I began to sprint up the stairs as fast as I could manage. Now back then, I was fairly athletic. I did quite a few sports in my free time, so it didn't wind me too bad to sprint up these stairs. When I'm about halfway up, I hear the stairwell door slam open and footsteps begin sprinting up the stairs. I paused for a second, terrified, and looked down into the stairwell. I saw the face of that guy staring up at me from 2 floors below before he immediately began to run after me. I ran as fast as I could up the remaining floors, my legs burning from how fast I was going, barely able to catch my breath. I finally get to my friend's floor and exit the stairwell. I get to her door and begin to pound on it, crying and begging for her to let me in right away. She opens the door confused, and I run inside, slamming it behind her. There I am crying and shaking as she gets the story out of me. Her older brother, who was a 20-year-old guy and built really big, heard all of this just as he'd come out of his room to find out what the commotion was. He charged out of the flat right away and began to hunt the building for the man, but he could not find him anywhere. I never saw that man from the elevator again. I don't know what he wanted me for, or what he planned to do to me if he caught me, and I'm glad I never found out. It feels a bit corny to start this off by saying it was a dark and stormy night, so let's just agree to say the weather was shit. I was on my way to a convention in Chicago with two of my very good friends. We went year after year, and this was the fourth time of us going. The Weather Channel had called for very severe weather, but we refused to miss our annual overnight trip for anything. We all piled in my car for a 6-hour drive. The first few hours was fine, just raining and quite humid. Then, the typical Midwest severe thunderstorm started. The kind where you just look down at the lines on the road so you don't end up in the ditch since you can't see anything else. Once, when the lightning flashed, my friend Chris swore he saw a tornado in a cornfield in the distance. After this, we decided to give up and pull under a bridge until the rain let up enough for us to see. We waited a good 45 minutes and were running hours late from driving so slow through the storm. The rest of the trip was drizzle and that post-thunderstorm fog that's always felt very creepy to me. There were hardly any other cars on the interstate, since most people were too smart to be out driving in such weather, which just added more to the creepy feeling. We didn't get to our motel until about 2 a.m. Since we were poor college kids, we never stayed at the convention hotel. Luckily, we had found a little motel a 20-minute drive away that was dirt cheap. We stayed at this motel every time we came to the convention. It was 3 stories tall with no interior hallways. All the rooms were accessed from outside. Unfortunately, the cheapest rooms were on the 3rd floor, and the elevator had not worked any of the times we visited. Checking into the motel in the middle of the night was quite interesting. It was still foggy and drizzling out, but also humid and quite hot as well. There were only 2 or 3 other cars in the dark parking lot, and the only lights were from the lobby and the street lights. We walked inside and no one was at the desk. After ringing the bell for about 15 minutes with no response, we actually called the motel from my friend's cell phone. An older man answered and soon came out to the desk from a back room. We tried to negotiate a 1st floor room since obviously they were not very busy. He was quite the jerk though and kept saying, "We're booked, we're booked." There were only 2 or 3 other cars there. Certainly, some room on the 1st floor had to be available. Being exhausted though, we took our 3rd floor room and prepared ourselves to drag our suitcases up 3 flights of outside stairs in the drizzle and heat. As we were leaving the lobby, the old man called out to us, "You kids better lock your door and don't answer it after dark." He went back into the back room and slammed it shut. God, that creeped me out. We unloaded the car in the dark, foggy parking lot and dragged our luggage to the stairs. As we came around the back of the building, we saw the elevator. The out of order sign was gone, and the doors were wide open. The light in the elevator was the only light source on the entire back of the building. It seemed like something good had finally happened to us on the trip. The elevator was working, and we didn't have to lug all our things up those slippery stairs. I remember thinking it was weird that the doors were open though. Don't elevator doors usually stay closed until you push the button? But whatever, it was better than the stairs at least. We loaded in our luggage and got in. I pushed the button for the 3rd floor, and the doors started to close. The doors were standard elevator doors, and right before they closed all the way, words appeared written on the back of it. Written in red paint or marker or something on the far side of the elevator door so that it was only visible when the doors closed. It said, "Well, you're fucked now. Sorry, fuckers." The elevator started moving. We all stared at that door. My friend, Chris, from behind said the obvious thing we were all thinking. "Guys, I think we're fucked." It took that damn elevator forever to get to the 3rd floor. With a ding, the doors slowly opened. None of us moved. I think we were all waiting for something to come trundling out of the fog, or one of those sirens from Silent Hill to start or something. But nothing like that happened. The doors started to close, and my friend Amy quickly shoved her suitcase in the way of the door. We all scrambled out. The elevator door closed, and we heard it go down to the ground level again, abandoning us to our fate. Slowly, we all 3 came around to the side of the building. Nothing was there but a long walkway open to the elements, with doors along the left side. Completely terrified now, we crept towards our room, which was halfway down the walkway. We were almost there when we heard it. Loud and clear in the night. Ding. It was that goddamn elevator, returning to the 3rd floor. We sprinted to the room. Chris had the key and frantically tried to get our door open, as the other 2 of us stared toward the back of the building to see who would come trundling around that corner. Click. The door was opened, and we bolted into the room. We locked every lock on that door and braced our suitcases up against it for good measure. We stood inside listening for anything else. We heard nothing. Being the only guy in the group, Chris looked outside after a few minutes, but he couldn't see anything either. I don't think any of us slept well that night, and we never stayed in that motel again.